They were moved without chains, without fences, and without warning. When the truck stopped high in the Colorado Rockies, the prisoners saw no guard towers, only endless mountains. To men who had spent years behind barbed wire, the open terrain felt like a quiet mistake. Some whispered that the Americans had underestimated them. What they didn't realize was that the mountains were already closing in. By the winter of 1943, German prisoners of war held in the United States had learned to read the signs of captivity: fences topped with wire, armed guards at every corner, floodlights cutting through the night. So when a selected group of POWs was transferred from a guarded camp to a remote work assignment deep in the Colorado Rockies, the absence of those signs felt unsettling and strangely hopeful. The journey itself hinted at something different. The trucks climbed higher and higher, winding through narrow mountain roads, leaving towns and rail lines far behind. When they finally stopped, there were no barracks surrounded by wire. No watchtowers. No soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder with rifles ready. Instead, there were wooden work buildings, snow-covered slopes, and a silence so deep it felt unnatural to men used to shouting commands and marching boots. The prisoners were told they would be working in the mountains, maintaining trails, cutting timber, assisting with infrastructure in areas too remote for civilian labor. It sounded less like imprisonment and more like exile. And to some of the men, exile felt dangerously close to opportunity. At night, in hushed conversations, theories spread. Why would the Americans place enemy soldiers in such an open environment? Why trust geography instead of guns? A few prisoners began tracing imaginary escape routes with their fingers, pointing toward distant ridgelines and valleys hidden by snowfall. They believed that once beyond the next mountain, they could disappear, blend into the vastness, find a town, maybe even make it to Mexico. What they failed to understand was scale. The Colorado Rockies were not just mountains, they were a system designed by nature to isolate. The air was thin and punishing. Temperatures dropped without warning. Distances that looked manageable in clear daylight became lethal after sunset. Roads vanished into snowdrifts. Trails ended abruptly at cliffs or dense forest. And beyond the work sites, there was nothing: no food, no shelter, no help. American guards didn't need fences here. They watched quietly, confident that the terrain would do what barbed wire could not. Within days, the prisoners would begin to sense it: the weight of the cold, the exhaustion from altitude, the way the mountains swallowed sound and direction alike. What first appeared to be freedom was revealing itself as something far more dangerous. And the illusion was already starting to crack. The first days in the mountains were almost surreal. POWs rose before dawn, their breath visible in the icy air, and trudged through snow that sometimes reached their knees. The work itself was grueling but deceptively simple: clearing fallen trees, repairing trails, and hauling timber down steep slopes. Each task felt harmless enough, yet the men were acutely aware of the strange absence of barriers. There were no fences to climb, no guards shouting orders, no watchful eyes to follow their every step. And in that absence, a dangerous idea took root: perhaps the Americans had made a mistake. Some of the prisoners began to test the terrain, wandering a little further each day under the guise of work. Peaks that looked reachable in the morning light seemed to recede as the sun rose higher. Valleys that appeared manageable revealed hidden crevices, frozen streams, and sudden cliffs. The cold was a relentless companion, sapping energy faster than any march behind barbed wire ever could. And yet, the illusion of possibility persisted. A handful of men whispered plans, imagining themselves slipping silently into the wilderness, free once they crossed the next ridge. But the mountains had their own rules, ones no man could break with cleverness or courage alone. Frostbite crept along fingers and toes while snowstorms erupted without warning, turning paths into treacherous traps. Thin air at altitude made every step heavier, every breath a labor. The terrain itself seemed to push them back, a subtle but unyielding force. Some prisoners collapsed during work, shivering, exhausted, and disoriented. The few who tried to push beyond their immediate surroundings found themselves disoriented in a landscape that looked the same in every direction. The Rockies swallowed them whole, not with walls of metal, but with sheer distance, isolation, and peril. By the third day, the first murmurs of doubt surfaced. Men who had spoken confidently of escape now hesitated, measuring each step against their fatigue and the growing fear in their hearts. The more they explored, the more obvious the danger became. The snow-covered peaks and endless forests weren't simply a backdrop, they were an active participant in the prison. Every misstep could lead to a fall, every wrong turn to hours lost in the cold, and every moment away from the worksite increased the chance of being caught, or worse, succumbing to the elements. Some tried to convince themselves that perseverance would lead to freedom. Others quietly resigned, huddling together at night in makeshift shelters, listening to the wind howl through the trees and the distant cracking of ice. It was becoming clear that the mountains themselves were a gauntlet, a natural prison that demanded respect and obedience. The realization was slow, cruel, and unavoidable. The open space that had seemed like opportunity was in fact a trap, and nature was far more vigilant than any human guard. And yet, despite the growing awareness, a spark of hope lingered in a few hearts, the stubborn belief that if they just found the right path, just the right moment, they could outsmart the mountains themselves. It was a dangerous hope, one that would soon clash brutally with reality. By the end of the first week, the euphoria of perceived freedom had begun to fade. The prisoners, once quietly confident in their ability to navigate the open Rockies, were learning that the mountains were indifferent to human ambition. Each morning brought the same harsh reminders: frostbitten fingers, aching muscles, and the dizzying thinness of the air. Men who had imagined themselves slipping through the wilderness were now struggling just to return from their assigned work before sunset. The Rockies were no mere backdrop, they were a gauntlet that measured strength, endurance, and, most cruelly, hope itself. Small attempts at escape ended almost immediately in disorientation. Trails that seemed clear in daylight twisted into maze-like corridors among trees and rocks. Snow-covered creeks turned into icy traps, and sudden cliffs rose where men expected gentle slopes. Some POWs wandered for hours, only to find themselves back at the same worksite they had left, exhausted and shivering. Their maps, hand-drawn with careful optimism, proved useless against the subtle complexity of the terrain. With each failed attempt, morale sank further. What had looked like an opportunity to some now revealed itself as a silent, invisible prison. The cold became an ever-present enemy. At night, temperatures dropped far below what they had experienced in other camps. Sleep was fitful, punctuated by the whisper of wind through pine trees and the distant cracking of ice. Some men huddled together for warmth, sharing tattered blankets, while others paced restlessly, unwilling to admit defeat even as their bodies begged for rest. Food was rationed and hard-earned, and the isolation magnified every ache and fear. It was one thing to survive behind a fence, it was another to survive without guidance, without shelter, without certainty in a wilderness that seemed alive with quiet menace. Rumors circulated among the prisoners, stories of men lost to the mountains, swept away by blizzards or succumbing to exhaustion. At first, the tales were dismissed as exaggeration. But when a fellow POW failed to return from a work assignment for hours, fear replaced denial. Slowly, the psychological weight of the mountains began to crush more effectively than any barbed wire ever could. The terrain enforced a discipline harsher than military oversight. It demanded respect, submission, and caution. Attempting to outsmart it was not merely futile, it was dangerous. By the second week, even the most optimistic prisoners had begun to understand the truth. Freedom, as they had imagined it, did not exist here. The mountains themselves were the jailers, silent and absolute. Every ridge, every frozen creek, every hidden drop-off was a reminder of human limits. The vast openness, once seductive in its promise of liberty, now felt like endless walls pressing in from every direction. The landscape that had seemed to offer escape had become a gauntlet, one that punished ambition with frost, fatigue, and the constant threat of injury or death. And yet, a stubborn kernel of hope lingered. Some men refused to give in completely, their minds clinging to the belief that the mountain's grip could be beaten with courage, luck, or cunning. It was a dangerous illusion, one that would test them in ways no POW camp ever could. The Rockies had taught them a hard lesson. In this prison, the enemy was not just the Americans, it was the mountain itself, indifferent and unyielding. By the third week, any illusions of escape had all but vanished. The prisoners, once emboldened by open skies and seemingly limitless horizons, now understood the cruel reality: the mountains themselves were their captors. Each day brought new reminders of how small and fragile a man was in such terrain. Snowstorms could materialize in minutes, reducing visibility to mere feet. Trails they had memorized disappeared under fresh drifts, and hidden ravines turned every step into a potential death trap. The Rockies were no mistake, they were a natural prison, indifferent to hope, fear, or ambition. Those who had whispered about freedom now spoke in hushed tones of survival. The work, which had first seemed like a strange opportunity, became a relentless test of endurance. Hauling timber down steep inclines, clearing snow-blocked paths, and repairing remote cabins demanded every ounce of strength, while the bitter cold gnawed at exposed skin and the high altitude stole breath with cruel efficiency. Even the fittest men began to falter, their movements slower, hands shaking, minds fogged by exhaustion. The mountains exacted their toll not with guns or barbed wire, but with fatigue, frostbite, and fear. Isolation weighed as heavily as the physical challenges. With no towns, no civilians, and no other soldiers nearby, every sound, the snap of a branch, the distant howl of wind, felt like a warning. Men huddled together at night, wrapped in thin blankets, listening to the mountains speak in ways they could not control. Some cried quietly for home, for families, for a world that seemed impossibly far away. Others silently cursed themselves for ever believing that the openness of the Rockies could be an escape. The very scale of the mountains made the prisoners confront the limits of human endurance, and for many, the limit arrived sooner than expected. A few tried to push further, testing the boundaries of their invisible prison. They followed faint animal tracks, climbed ridgelines, and scrambled down rocky slopes. Each attempt ended the same way: lost, exhausted, and forced back to the worksite. It was a merciless lesson. The mountains had already mapped out every route, every obstacle, every chance of survival. The POWs discovered that freedom was not a matter of cunning or bravery, it was a measure of stamina and luck, and in this environment, luck favored no one. By the end, the psychological weight was perhaps even heavier than the physical strain. The prisoners realized that they had been deceived not by their captors but by their own imaginations. The mountains, vast and wild, had promised freedom but delivered only isolation, exhaustion, and the quiet knowledge that escape was impossible. No fences, no towers, no armed guards, yet every man remained confined. The landscape itself had become a jailer more absolute than any human hand. When the Americans finally checked the men at the end of the week, they found weary, frost-bitten prisoners returning dutifully to work. There had been no audacious escapes, no clever detours. The prisoners had learned a harsh truth: in Colorado, freedom was an illusion. The mountains were a prison, and the price of overestimating them was the slow erosion of hope. The Rockies had claimed their lesson, and every man understood that here, survival, not liberty, was the only reality. In the end, the German POWs learned that the Colorado mountains were never meant to let them leave, and the mountains themselves had ensured that lesson would not be forgotten. These stories are rarely told. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one.